Well, let me bring Philip back into the conversation here. Philip, because of your proximity to the prime ministers, what is your opinion of the Gulf states? Are they going to try to stay neutral? Are they going to take sides? Which side? What do you
Well,
think is
they're in a
going to
very,
happen?
very difficult spot, especially places like Dubai. You know, you know, historically, for example, the UAE, it's a place that has a huge sense of security, especially for people like British citizens flocking into the UAE. In the last few weeks, we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars wiped off. The stock market, property. I've got a lot of friends out in Dubai, and looking at the state of real estate there, for example, people that are literally negative equity now because pretty much overnight it's just wiped all of this money off. Now, from a UK perspective, the Prime Minister is focusing, I'm pretty sure right now, on his legacy. He's looking back and having a bit of deja vu from 2003, and he's thinking, do I want to be known as, the kind of Tony Blair 2.0? So all of these things, he's going to be looking at. He's going to be focusing mostly on the stability of energy markets and maritime security, and the fact that there's so many, tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus, of British citizens, in that part of the world. And then from the UAE's perspective, for example, and other sort of Gulf states, what have they got? They've got oil, but the oil is drying up, and they've got tourism and people traveling there. This has caused obviously a huge nightmare for everyone in that area, because everyone's leaving, everyone's worried, and their hands might be tied at some point, because look how many billions of dollars the UAE has invested in the US, is vice versa, really, with AI and data centers and technology, and all the rest of it. So I think, as a country, we're focusing very much on the UAE, but as a whole, they probably want to remain neutral. But how long are they going to be able to remain neutral? In the same sense that right now, the UK is saying very much that they're not involved. Their bases can only be used for defensive purposes. He didn't really have a choice. The US kind of, stated that they have to, and he sort of reluctantly agreed. But what else could he say? But how long can he remain in that situation when potentially, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of British lives are at risk? And how long is it going to be before he weighs in on things, and aligns himself a bit more with the Trump administration and others?
Right, right, right. Interesting. What do you guys think?
I just want to say, like, with the direction things are going, and as we talked about power, I think there's a very high probability that some nefarious actors could be false flag attacked in order to gain popular support to have boots on the ground go in Iran. And I really think that that's a factor that we have to be spreading the message that we shouldn't be allowing people to fall for this trap of, a false flag attack to occur in the United States, possibly motivated by particular nations that it's in their interest for this conflict to expand and push a popularity to have, the populations increase their support to putting boots on the ground. And I think that's a very high probability, and it's gaining momentum all the time. And there's actually a couple nations in this planet that I think are looking to false flag attacks to bolster their control over their populations, to increase maybe the political maneuvers to have conscription start occurring. And you can see a lot of exercises within the NATO alliance, especially in the Baltic regions, where they're creating, part-time stay camps, or they're expanding military zones where, they can have people who are, counter to the military that are going on. And that has been encroaching the Western world. Many of the countries like Canada and Australia, you could see in the UK, it's all focused around removing people's freedoms of expression. And so we're in a high state of watchfulness in order to counteract any kind of false flag attacks that are going to be falsely used to bolster the populations politically. We have to be aware of that as a reality right now.
It's interesting what you said, Philip. What choice do they have as far as the U.S. requests of the UK? And it just made me think, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense because if they have spent the last 80 years, um, tooling their entire country to be basically an assistant to the U.S. in some ways, then they really, they may be very, very limited in what their answers can be, unless they're going to decide to assist a different country.
Well, that's it. Historically, they've been puppets of the US, and very much, back in 2003 when Tony Blair received that call from George Bush, he was very much of the mindset, look, yes, of course, George, whatever goes, whatever you say, we're behind you 100%. Now he's probably having second thoughts about, right, when I receive that call from Donald Trump, what do I say? Knowing from historic events, how things went and the reasons that we went into Iraq before, and what we know now that there wasn't actually weapons of mass destruction, which was the whole point of going into Iraq in the first place. So I think he's just treading a bit more carefully, but it just it's how much more pressure is he going to get, both from the US administration and his own advisors, his team around him, his ministers. It could push him sort of over that level, and they could very much get more involved, and that will obviously cause a huge escalation if the US start acting in that way as well, because letting the US use some of their bases is one thing, and it's still showing that they are involved in this war. Let's not say they're not involved. Yes, they are involved purely by assisting the US with use of their military bases. But I think I personally think it could escalate to the point where they're getting more and more involved. I think that's the way it is going to go, and I think his hands are going to be tied eventually. If things
project a little bit here, I just would like to bring up a concept where I think the American strategy here is very deceptive, and they're on a pathway of using a strategy called strategic sequencing. And I also think that this narrative of political gamesmanship between the alliance members is a lot for show at this point, especially after so many years of the conflict going on in Ukraine. I think this is all for show. I think it's been planned. And what I do think is there's been a partitioning of regional responsibilities that has been divvied in secret amongst them, where the British and the French are going to be bolstering the Ukrainian Russia areas up into Romania. And I think that's why you don't have participation of the British. We're right now being advertised to go to the Middle East, because that's going to be the Americans' responsibility right now, and they are playing a game right now politically. I don't believe any of this gamesmanship you see politically. I absolutely see that as a strategic misinformation campaign, and it's being well played. And if anything, Trump is actually playing a game where he's going around disrupting the legacy powers, whether it be from Japan and everything, because he's basically telling everybody, you better get your militaries on board and ready, and you'll be given an area of responsibility because we're doing this. And that's what I think is happening. America's on a path of strategic sequencing. They've been started this a long time ago. They were pulling out of Ukraine on purpose to make sure that the Europeans step into the responsibility of holding the line there. And they went into Venezuela to secure oil assets, and they're moving from one to another. And you see that Trump has no problem with upsetting leaders from every nation. And what he's basically doing is he's putting a fire under them so that they bolster resources, so that they could march this sequencing across the planet towards China. And we're talking about a roundtable of World War III, and you have to have China in this equation in the end of the conversation. It's necessary.
That is fascinating and scary.